Is IFS a safe form of therapy? That's a question I set out to do a video on, and in the end I found myself writing out 3 videos on the topic. So this video is actually the third in a series, and the one where I'll finally let myself stand more unabashedly in defense of IFS. Because I think you can make a strong argument that IFS, at least considering its depth, may be one of our very safest models out there. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, in this video, I want to free myself to really stand in defense of IFS as doing a remarkably impressive job of attending to safety. That being said, nothing is simple, so we'll look at some of the complexities involved, particularly around working with people in acute distress. But before we do that, let me quickly summarize what we covered in the first 2 videos. In those videos, we talked more about the discrete fears that people tend to bring up around IFS or just parts work in general. Specifically, can it cause you to remember false memories of abuse? And also, can it cause you to fragment into a state that is closer to multiple personality disorder or DID? Now, on both of those concerns, I came down on the side of not seeing a clear reason for much concern. However, I tried to hold my position with humility and look at it from different angles and take the concern seriously. But in doing so, I didn't really allow myself to just present a full-throated defense of IFS as likely being probably one of our safer healing modalities. So I'd like to do that now, but first let me go ahead and say what I personally perceive to be the biggest risk of IFS, or really any depth model, and that's the risk of a therapist feeling so excited about the hope of deeper healing that they fail to notice that their client is really more in need of stabilization for the sake of regulation versus inner exploration for the sake of healing. That can be a frustrating call to make because, in truth, clients who present as the most distressed are absolutely the ones who are often in the most desperate need of deep healing. And you don't want to always just keep pushing that down the road because until some level of deeper work can occur, the cycle of trauma often just keeps repeating. That being said, stabilization first, inner exploration when somebody is ready. That's just a foundational element of ethical trauma care. And in a moment, I want to give an example of how we might diverge from IFS for people who need stabilization. But before I do that, let me finally take my chance to defend IFS as a generally safe treatment. And I'll break it down into 2 parts. First, the techniques themselves, and then the stance of the therapist. Let's start with technique. I've never seen another model whose techniques are so oriented around safety, at least not without giving up the goal of healing. And in IFS, safety starts with the practice of what is called unblending. To unblend means to pause, step back, and try to mindfully observe our inner feelings or reactions or parts rather than being swept away by them. This would traditionally be called mentalization, which is very well researched, where it's adding to it a stance of self-compassion and curiosity and an effort to not only observe, but also learn from. It's a version of mindfulness, you could say, but perhaps with even more observing distance than is typical for experiential therapy. In many other experiential models, you more fully and directly try to feel your unresolved pain, although hopefully in a new way, which can be great. But in IFS, you don't actually ever try to re-experience any pain. You want to bear witness to it, but with more distance than is typical for depth work. That probably explains why I've noticed even a little less crying in IFS than what I'm used to. Not that it doesn't happen, nor that it's a bad thing when it does. But it's just wild for me to hear people wonder about whether IFS may be more dangerous than other kinds of therapy, given how complete attunement to safety is woven into each step of the model. Even if we just linger with a step of unblending, not only does it allow us to skip some observing distance from our distress, it also opens the chance to bring online a much deeper well of resource. We think of this more resource state as simply who we truly are under all of our learned ways of being or reactivated states or parts. That's why we call it self or self-energy. I do sometimes wonder if we've oversold how reliably or fully self just shows up through trying to unblend, but unblending certainly can be a hugely helpful step. It's probably as powerful as any other therapy technique I've heard of in terms of helping people feel more resourced. That doesn't mean it will always be the right tool for everyone, but it is a wonderful discovery. And while it's similar to mentalization, it really builds on it in some important ways. It's a funny thing because I study and integrate a lot of experiential psychodynamic and emotion-focused therapies. And guess what is one of the things these therapies have started to recommend when clients begin to feel overwhelmed? To shift into IFS or some IFS techniques, especially unblending. The practice of unblending can really help the client just get a little breathing room from what has gotten activated. In addition to all of that, IFS does another thing that is pretty unique. It tries to never push people past their defenses. Many depth models sort of angle to get past our defenses because indeed defenses can block healing. And honestly, I'm not always totally against trying to challenge or sidestep defenses. It can be a productive strategy, but it can be emotionally intense to so rapidly disarm oneself in that way. And IFS is one of the first healing models to say, no, we are not pushing past any defenses. We're going to go slow and start with getting to know our defenses first. We will try to understand why they had to come online, how they've protected us, what it is they're protecting us from, or in other words, what they learned to fear and expect, whether that be rejection or overwhelm or abuse. We will witness anything they want to share until they feel understood and finally not alone. We will send them appreciation and compassion for all the ways they've protected us. And only when all of that creates enough trust in our system will we even ask permission to go deeper. Emphasis on ask permission. If any place inside has any concern around accessing deeper parts of our experience, especially if they involve pain, we pause with that and address the concerns and work together to make a plan that feels safe. It's hard to imagine a more gentle, respectful approach to depth than that. As I mentioned in a previous video, one complaint I've heard clients report about IFS is that it at times plays it a little too safe. Okay, so that's all in the realm of technique, but what about the stance of the therapist? Here's where we open up to an even deeper aspect of the model. And that is the emphasis on the therapist being in self-energy, or in other words, unblended from their own parts. Another way to describe that would be to say that the IFS therapist tries to step back from fear or agenda or judgment and ground themselves in an open posture of presence and witnessing. People, especially clients, can miss this layer because this isn't a technique that you see on the surface. But the IFS Institute is actually really clear on the following point. What makes the therapy IFS therapy is not whether the client is unblending from their parts to find the deeper, more resource self, but more so whether the therapist is doing so. I think this is actually a really profound point, that IFS is about the emotional maturity and capacity that the therapist is bringing. Are they trying to help their clients get there too? Absolutely, but that's secondary. I mean, I know the therapist always coming from self-energy is a lofty goal, and can I promise it will always be achieved? No. But it is such a wonderful goal to shoot for, even to head in that direction and do a little bit better in terms of what we therapists are bringing ourselves emotionally to the work is so important. In fact, I think we therapists managing not to bring our own issues into the work is perhaps the most important conversation we can have around safety in therapy. And that might be the most important sentence I've said in all 3 videos. So let me say it again. I think therapists learning to manage, or preferably heal, our own issues or traumas is perhaps the most important conversation we can have around safety in therapy. In the qualitative research, when clients report feeling harmed by therapy and they are asked what was harmful, they don't generally point to a technique used, they point to the therapist, to some kind of rupture in the relationship, most commonly around feeling dismissed or blamed. So if we really want to have an honest conversation around safety in therapy, we will be talking about how to help therapists, like really help them. Whether that be to help them to heal, like through their own therapy, or learn better interpersonal skills, or even just develop self-awareness. And while not every IFS therapist is perfect by far, at least they get some training in how to pay attention to this domain. I remember when I was being trained by a man named Derek Scott, who by the way put some great demos of IFS on YouTube. He had us list out as a group all the parts of us that can get triggered in sessions that impede the work. These included parts that want to rescue or be the savior, parts who feel anxious to be liked and therefore never risk challenging the client, parts that feel like an imposter and overcompensate by sounding smart, parts that get defensive when challenged and put everything back on the client, parts that fear emotional closeness and keep aloof under the guise of professionalism. Then for each of these, he had us discuss what it would feel like to be on the receiving side of that for the client. And then, of course, over the course of the training, we supported one another to inwardly have a more compassionate relationship, what we call our therapist parts, so that they can feel safe enough to soften back in session, right? So that our deeper, more fully present adult self could show up to do the work. Okay, but moving on, if you're thinking, gosh, why take all these risks in the first place? Isn't the point to be helped? If healing work can possibly mess with you, how is it healing? Well, here's the thing. Doing nothing, or even just not doing enough, maybe only working to manage symptoms, can by far be the worst danger. I hear this from people all the time. They tell me, wow, I'm so glad I found IFS or some other healing model because I thought I had tried everything. I'd done all the therapies I was supposed to do, and it wasn't enough. And I was about to give up. If I hadn't learned that it's possible to finally deal with my pain and address my suffering at its root, I would not be here today. I might have heard that 100 times. So when I aim to do deeper work, it's not just for the fun of it, nor something I take on lightly. This point actually reminds me of something that my mentor, Bruce Ecker, who is not an IFS therapist, he invented a form of therapy called coherence therapy. But he says, go minimally deep. In other words, we need to know how to go as deep as is necessary for healing, but then go no deeper. You see, unlike older forms of depth work, experiential work tends to be more focused. We start with a symptom the person wants to change, and then work to uncover what is causing it. And if the root of the issue is deep, then we have to know how to go deep. But it isn't going deep just to muck around in there. We go on this journey because we're on a mission to help. My mother once told me that when she's working with her clients, she sometimes envisions that there's a part of them sort of lost behind a wall of their pain or defenses. And she tells them, look, if you want, we can come side by side, get ready, and go on a rescue mission. I loved hearing her say that because her words captured that one, this is not done casually, but two, it is really important. After all, so many people are really stuck in deep suffering, and they are willing to do difficult, layered work for the sake of finally having a happy life. I mean, happy is kind of a vague word. For me, the goal is to be present enough to have a rich life with the good and the bad, to feel our vitality and realness. And for people with trauma, that can be really difficult even after they've been sufficiently stabilized. And I think they have the right to want more than that, even if it comes with some risks. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox on that, but I just wanted to give you a sense for why I'm really excited to see more conversation around actual healing versus just symptom management. In particular, I love that IFS gives people a clearer map for understanding how our inner world is impacted by things. And I can tell you, it's a pretty freaking accurate universal map. I think I've studied just about every major map of the human mind there is, and the IFS map is the most elegant I've ever seen. It synthesizes the most important elements without any extra. Some people say that Jungian theory has more nuance and richness, which is probably true. But I know from having grown up around psychoanalytic theory that we can also sometimes drown in nuance. And I think IFS balances complexity and simplicity really well. It holds the most important things to understand about the mind without needing years of study to understand it. And that is why people are falling in love with the IFS's approach to mapping parts. But could there be a downside to it being so accessible and exciting? I don't know. Look, it's fun in podcasts to get excited and geek out about things and feel inspired. But I think in our culture, particularly online culture, it's true that we tend to love or hate the surface level of things. And because there's a lot to love in the surface of IFS, I'm sure many therapists and clients are sort of grabbing onto the general idea of parts work and kind of doing IFS light or using IFS techniques out of context. Honestly, that hasn't concerned me too much, especially if the work is then kept kind of light. But I'm open to the possibility that I should be more concerned, because even though IFS is really gentle, and you could even argue because it's so gentle, at times it actually can go quite deep quite quickly. So if you're playing around with some parts work and you're starting to go deeper, you either need to be really ready to slow that down or really ready to go. In other words, to know how to do deeper work safely, which is why training is so important. If someone is taking a surface understanding of IFS and using it to explore deep trauma, that's just not going to be safe. At least not unless that person has a solid training in other trauma models. That's why it would not surprise me if some people have been harmed by parts work, and I don't think we need to take that lightly. And we certainly shouldn't be pushing clients into parts work when they seem at all uncomfortable with it. In fact, let's review what an IFS therapist is supposed to do when we begin to try out parts work, but then the person seems at all disturbed or disoriented by the process. The advice in that case is to stop with parts work, pause, and instead of trying to get the client to unblend to find self-energy and all of that, the therapist is meant to just really focus on settling into their own self-energy. And then from there, they're encouraged to just reflect back what the client is sharing in an organizing way while bringing in and slowly helping the client to bring in more curiosity and compassion. That would look a lot more like regular therapy, probably humanistic therapy. Okay, so that's pretty good advice, pretty safe. However, when people are dealing with a lot of inner and outer chaos because of trauma, I think they may need a little bit more. And that brings us to one final discussion. I know we've already covered a lot. If we can just add one piece to the puzzle, and that is this, that it might be a good idea for IFS therapists and all therapists to have some tools in their tool belt specifically designed for stabilization. Because stabilization is its own unique challenge. One person who would know more about this than me is Janina Fisher. She developed a model called TIST, Trauma-Informed Stabilization Treatment, which, as the name suggests, is specifically focused on stabilization. And interestingly, she uses parts work as well. But I remember being at a training with her once where someone asked a question. She answered about how you would help them understand the parts at play. And they were like, okay, so you do IFS there? And she was like, no, this is not IFS. This is a treatment specifically focused on stabilization. As it turns out, there are some things she does differently. She keeps it more cognitive and psychoeducational and tightly structured. It's great how she's found a way to draw on experiential techniques, but in a manner that is so stabilizing. Needless to say, when I learned about her approach, I did think, I can see how this is more realistic and potentially a safer way of working for people who are experiencing highly reactive or overwhelmed states due to trauma. Of course, there are other therapies aimed at stabilization, DBT, among others. In any case, it's an important conversation around when to hold off on IFS, or at least integrate other techniques. I honestly do think most IFS therapists do integrate other techniques as needed, but it's a conversation we need to continue having. And it is an especially important one, given that IFS, more than any other depth model, has promoted versions of parts work that people can do on their own without a therapist even present. Whether that's a good idea, I have such mixed feelings about. I mean, for many, it's amazing, even life-saving. So I wouldn't want to take it off the table as an option. But for people with underlying trauma that they haven't yet addressed in therapy, probably it's pretty risky to try IFS on their own. And I know sometimes it's like the only option. I get contacted all the time by people living in parts of the world where therapy is not readily available, and they are so glad to have found a system they can do at least aspects of on their own. At some point, the topic of self-therapy is worth a whole video, so we won't open that topic now. But of any area, I think that's probably where we are in the most immediate need of some research. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up here and move on to the issue of whether IFS is scientific. The truth is, I think IFS may be one of our most scientifically sound models, but how I can say that when it only has one randomized control trial gets into this whole debate called the Great Psychotherapy Debate, which questions whether randomized control trials are actually all that informative. I didn't have time to write a whole video on that topic, although I therefore did insert some thoughts into the first video in the series, and I'll put some references below. For now, to begin to answer the is IFS scientific question, I'll just link to a video I'd already written long ago that looks at the science behind the idea of parts. Perhaps that will at least be a starting point. Following that, there'll be a video on why going deep in therapy is so important in the first place. The truth is, revisiting old pain can be so powerful and healing in ways that I'm not sure even all therapists fully understand. In that video, we'll look at what is happening in the brain when we revisit our old pain, but in a new way. So please stay tuned. I'm Dr. Tori Olds, and I so appreciate your watching.
Welcome, friend, come inside.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, I would love if you shared it with a friend or a colleague. And if you're enjoying my channel, it would mean a lot to me if you could like or subscribe. Thanks.